greed can poison even the deepest bloodlines. Relatives openly mocked Clara when her grandfather's will left her nothing but a rusted heavy iron key. Yet before midnight struck, that single piece of cold metal would annihilate a historic corporate empire and unearth unforgivable secrets meant to stay buried. Listen closely. The grandfather clock in the study of the Harrington estate ticked with an agonizing, heavy rhythm, each second feeling like a physical blow against the silence of the room. Outside, a bleak November rain lashed against the towering stained-glass windows of the Connecticut mansion. The storm was fitting. Rowan Harrington, the ruthless, brilliant, and deeply eccentric patriarch of Harrington Shipping and Logistics, had been dead for exactly 10 days. Today was the reading of the will. Sitting in the furthest corner of the expansive mahogany-paneled room was Kai Jenkins. She wasn't a Harrington by name, a fact that the rest of the occupants in the room made sure she never forgot. Kai was Rowan's granddaughter from his estranged late daughter Sarah. While the rest of the family had spent the last decade circling the globe, expanding their portfolios and waiting for the old man to finally die, Kai had been the one making his tea, managing his grueling doctor's appointments, and listening to his feverish late-night stories about his youth. She wore a simple, faded black wool coat. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her knuckles white. Across the sprawling antique Persian rug sat her uncle, Richard Harrington. Richard looked precisely like a man who was about to inherit $80 million. He was draped in a bespoke charcoal gray suit, casually checking a heavy gold Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. Beside him sat Beatrice Sterling, Rowan's youngest daughter. Beatrice was practically vibrating with nervous greed, her manicured fingers tightly clutching a crocodile-skin Birkin bag as if someone were about to snatch it from her. Her husband, Greg, stood behind her chair, a silent, smug sentinel. They hadn't spoken a single word to Kai since she arrived. Not a hello, not a how are you holding up, and certainly not a thank you for taking care of him. When she had walked into the study, Beatrice had merely offered a tight, disdainful sniff, shifting her chair an inch further away. To them, Kai was the hired help, a ghost in the machinery of their inheritance. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy oak doors opened and Alistair Montgomery, Rowan's longtime attorney, walked in. He was a tall, stooped man with a severe face and a thick, leather briefcase that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "Good morning," Alistair said, his voice dry as dust. He didn't offer condolences. He knew the Harringtons too well for pleasantries. "Let's get on with it, Alistair," Richard said, leaning back and crossing his legs. "The markets open in an hour, and I have a board meeting to prepare for. The transition needs to be seamless." Alistair adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, placing his briefcase on the heavy desk that once belonged to Rowan. He popped the brass locks with a sharp click that made Beatrice flinch. "Very well," Alistair murmured, pulling out a thick sheaf of high-quality parchment. "I am here to execute the final will and testament of Rowan William Harrington. I will remind you all that Rowan was of sound mind when this was drafted exactly 3 months ago." Kai swallowed hard, looking down at her scuffed boots. 3 months ago. That was right after Rowan had his second stroke. She remembered sitting by his bed feeding him ice chips while he stared at the ceiling, whispering about correcting the ledger. Alistair cleared his throat and began to read the legal preamble. The room held its collective breath. "To my eldest son, Richard Harrington," Alistair read, his voice monotone, "I leave 70% of the voting shares of Harrington Shipping and Logistics, granting him the controlling interest he has so desperately craved, along with the penthouse in Manhattan." Richard let out a long, slow exhale, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He shot a victorious glance at his sister. "To my daughter, Beatrice Sterling," Alistair continued, "I leave the Harrington estate in Connecticut, including all its contents, antiquities, and the surrounding 400 acres, as well as the sum of $15 million from my private offshore accounts." Beatrice gasped a genuine sound of sheer delight, pressing a hand to her chest. "Oh, Daddy," she whispered, though she hadn't visited Daddy in over 4 years. Kai felt a numb sensation spreading through her chest. It wasn't about the money. She had never expected millions. She had a modest job as a high school history teacher and lived in a cramped apartment in Queens. But she had hoped for something, a token of his affection, perhaps enough to pay off her suffocating student loans, or the small cottage on the edge of the property where she and her mother used to spend their summers. Alistair flipped a page. The rustle of the thick paper was the only sound in the room. And finally, Alistair said, pausing. He looked up, his eyes meeting Kai's over the rims of his glasses. The look was unreadable. To my granddaughter, Kai Jenkins. They chog, hobby. Richard rolled his eyes, letting out an audible sigh of annoyance. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, ready to contest any sum of money that dared to leave her immediate grasp. To Kai, who stood by me when the shadows grew long, Alistair read, I leave my most valuable possession, the key to the truth. Silence descended on the room. A thick, confusing silence. The truth? Richard scoffed, looking around. What does that even mean? Is there a monetary value attached to this? Truth? Alistair reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, incredibly battered wooden box. It looked like a cheap cigar box, water-stained and chipped at the edges. He walked across the room, bypassing Richard and Beatrice, and stopped in front of Kai. This is for you, Kai, Alistair said softly. Kai reached out with trembling hands and took the box. It was surprisingly heavy. She undid the small brass latch and flipped open the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of moth-eaten red velvet, was a single IMT. It was enormous, at least 6 inches long, heavily oxidized and completely archaic. It looked like it belonged to a medieval dungeon, not a modern inheritance. Tucked beneath the key was a small, folded piece of paper. A key? Beatrice burst into a shrill, mocking laugh. He left you a piece of junk? Good Lord, the dementia really did take him at the end, didn't it? Richard chuckled, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. Well, Kai, I suppose you can use it as a paperweight. Or maybe sell it at a flea market. If you need a reference for a new housekeeping job, Greg can write you one. Kai felt the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck, burning her cheeks. She closed the box with a snap, clutching it to her chest. She looked at Richard, his face glowing with arrogance, and Beatrice, who was already whispering excitedly to Greg about tearing down the west wing of the estate. Is that all, Mr. Montgomery? Kai asked, her voice shaking slightly. That is the entirety of the will, Kai, the lawyer replied. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something. Alistair's hand brushed against her elbow, and he gave it a firm, deliberate squeeze. Safe travels, Kai, he said, his eyes drilling into hers with intense urgency. Drive carefully, and pay attention to the roads you take. Not to, say, the drive back to Queens was a blur of grey highway and relentless rain. Kai's ancient Honda Civic rattled against the wind, the heater barely working. On the passenger seat, the battered wooden box sat like a silent passenger, mocking her. She played the scene in the study over and over in her head. The condescension, the utter dismissal. She remembered the long, grueling nights, waking up at 3 a.m. to help Rowan to the bathroom, changing his bedpans, rubbing his aching joints while he cried out from the phantom pains of a life lived too hard. She had sacrificed her 20s for him, put off dating, put off traveling, all because he was the last piece of family she had left. And in return, a rusty key and a riddle. When she finally reached her cramped third-floor walk-up, she locked the deadbolt, threw her wet coat over a kitchen chair, and sat down at her small dining table. She stared at the box for a long time before opening it again. The key was cold and rough against her skin. It had a complex, asymmetrical bowl, the part you hold, shaped like a twisting serpent, and the bitting, the part that goes into the lock, was incredibly intricate, featuring jagged, uneven teeth. She pulled out the folded piece of paper beneath it. It was a thick piece of cardstock, and Rowan's shaky spiderweb handwriting scrawled across it in black fountain pen ink. "Kai, my sweet girl, I only see the gold because gold is all they are worth. You see the foundation. The empire is built on a lie. Go to the place where I taught you to tell time. The serpent only bites at midnight. Do not trust Alistair with the ledger." "What the ledger?" I stared at the note, her heart suddenly pounding against her ribs. "Do not trust Alistair." The lawyer's final words echoed in her mind. "Pay attention to the roads you take." Was he warning her or threatening her? Why would Rowan use Alistair to deliver a message warning her against him? She forced herself to focus on the clues. "The place where I taught you to tell time." Her mind raced back, sifting through decades of memories. She thought of the grandfather clock in the study, but no, Rowan hadn't taught her to read a clock there. When she was 7 years old, she had spent a summer at the estate. Rowan, in a rare moment of grandfatherly patience, had taken her away from the chaotic main house down to the old abandoned train depot on the edge of the town of Willow Creek, about 20 miles from the estate. Rowan had loved trains. He had bought the derelict depot in the 1980s just to preserve it. There was a massive rusted clock tower above the station. Kai remembered sitting on his shoulders, learning how the big hand and the little hand worked while staring up at their cracked glass face. The serpent only bites at midnight. She looked down at the key. The bar was shaped like a serpent. It was already 8 p.m. If she was going to Willow Creek, she had to leave now. The swaggering enterprise was intensifying, but a strange burning determination had ignited in Kai's chest. Richard and Beatrice thought they had won. They thought the game was over. But Rowan had initiated a new one, and she was the only player. She packed a flashlight, a heavy iron crowbar she kept for self-defense, and slipped the key and the note into her waterproof jacket. The drive back toward Connecticut was treacherous. The roads were slick, and the darkness was absolute. As she navigated the winding rural backroads toward Willow Creek, the headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. A pair of bright halogen headlights keeping a steady distance behind her. Kai frowned. She sped up. The headlights sped up. She took a sharp, unannounced right turn onto a gravel utility road. The headlights followed, cutting through the rain. Panic flared in her throat. Pay attention to the roads you take. Someone was following her. Someone who knew that the key wasn't just a piece of junk. Kai gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She knew these back roads better than anyone. She used to ride her bike here as a teenager. She killed her headlights, plunging her car into pitch blackness, and slammed the brakes, throwing the car into a sharp skid down a narrow, overgrown logging trail hidden by the trees. She held her breath as the pursuing car roared past the hidden trail, its brake lights flashing red in the rain before it sped off into the distance. It was a black SUV with tinted windows. Shaking uncontrollably, Kai turned her headlights back on and carefully navigated her way to the old Willow Creek depot. The building was a decaying husk of Victorian brick and rotting wood. Above it, the massive clock tower loomed against the stormy sky. The hands on the shattered clock face were permanently stuck at 12 forward. Midnight. Kai stepped out into the freezing rain, clicking on her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the boarded-up entrance. She used the crowbar to pry the rotting planks away, the screech of rusty nails sounding terrifyingly loud in the quiet night. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and old grease. She shone the light around the cavernous waiting room. Dust motes danced in the beam. She made her way toward the back, where a narrow, spiral iron staircase led up to the clock tower. Her boots clanged against the metal steps. At the top, she found herself in a small circular room directly behind the massive clock face. The gears and cogs, rusted sharp for decades, filled the space. The serpent only bites at midnight. Kai moved her flashlight over the central axis of the clock mechanism. There, hidden beneath years of grime and cobwebs, was a keyhole. It wasn't a standard lock. It was shaped exactly like the jagged, uneven bitting of the iron key she held in her hand. Her hands trembled as she pulled the key from her pocket. She slid it into the mechanism. It fit perfectly. She took a deep breath, gripped the serpent-shaped bow, and turned it. With a grinding shriek of metal upon metal that sent a flock of pigeons bursting from the rafters, the massive gears of the clock slowly, agonizingly, began to rotate. The floor beneath Kai's feet shuddered, and a loud clack echoed through the tower as a section of the brick wall behind her suddenly swung open, revealing a pitch-black descending tunnel. The hidden tunnel was a sheer drop into the earth, lined with industrial steel rungs that felt slick and icy beneath Kai's trembling hands. The grinding echo of the clock gears had faded, replaced by the suffocating silence of the subterranean shaft. She climbed down rung by rung, her flashlight beam piercing the gloom. The air down here wasn't damp and rotting like the depot above. It was unnervingly dry, humming with the faint electronic vibration of climate control. Rowan had been preparing this place for a very long time. At the bottom of the 50-foot descent, her boots hit a solid concrete floor. She swung her flashlight around. She was standing in a narrow, reinforced bunker corridor that looked like it had been carved out of the bedrock itself. At the end of the hall stood a massive, brushed steel vault door. There was no keypad, no digital scanner, just a single heavy mechanical keyhole, identical to the one in the clock tower. Kai approached the door, her breath pluming in the cold air. She inserted the serpent key. It required both hands and all her upper body strength to turn the heavy iron bow, but with a deep resonating thud, the vault's locking bolts retracted. She pulled the heavy door open. Inside, the room was a stark contrast to the decaying train depot. It was a perfectly preserved mid-century office. A sleek walnut desk sat in the center, flanked by towering steel filing cabinets. An ancient emerald-green banker's lamp rested on the desk, and to Kai's absolute shock when she flicked the switch, it illuminated. The bunker had its own independent power grid. In the center of the desk sat a heavy, leather-bound book, the ledger Rowan had warned her about. Kai set her flashlight down and opened the heavy cover. The pages were filled with Rowan's meticulous handwriting, columns of numbers, and complex flowcharts. But as Kai, who had spent years grading high school history papers, began to read the annotations, the blood drained from her face. She wasn't looking at the financial history of a successful shipping empire. She was looking at a meticulously constructed, decades-long confession of financial sabotage. Rowan had loathed Richard's greed and Beatrice's vanity. He knew that the moment he died, they would strip Harrington Shipping and Logistics for parts, firing thousands of loyal employees to line their own pockets. So, Rowan had spent the last 15 years bleeding his own company dry. He had taken out massive, high-interest collateralized loans against the company's fleet, using the capital to quietly purchase untraceable gold bullion, bearer bonds, and prime, unencumbered real estate across Europe and Asia. To hide the massive debt, Rowan had fabricated shipping manifests and cooked the books with such brilliant, terrifying complexity that he had successfully defrauded the auditors at PricewaterhouseCoopers for over a decade. The massive profits Richard thought the company was making were an illusion, a house of cards propped up by illegal, toxic debt owed to some of the most unforgiving private equity firms and shadow lenders in the world. Rowan had placed the true, clean wealth, nearly $800 million in liquidated, untraceable assets, into a completely blind, airtight financial vehicle he called the Serpent Trust. Kai turned to the final page of the ledger. Taped to the parchment was a certified, notarized document establishing the Serpent Trust. The sole beneficiary, the only person with a legal right to access the offshore accounts and the safety deposit boxes in Geneva, was the bearer of the Iron Serpent Key, Kai Jenkins. She dropped the ledger. The breath caught in her throat. Richard and Beatrice hadn't inherited an empire. They had inherited a financial nuclear bomb. The mud was Sir truly noticed. The mud was the first thing she truly noticed. The mud was the first thing she truly noticed. The SEC would investigate. The fraud would be exposed. They would be entirely liable, facing not only complete bankruptcy but decades in federal prison. A sharp, metallic clatter echoed from the tunnel outside, violently shattering the silence of the bunker. Kai froze. "Look for a switch." The old man had to have rigged lights down here. A harsh, masculine voice echoed down the concrete shaft. It was Greg, Beatrice's husband. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through Kai's veins. The black SUV from the highway. They hadn't lost her. They had simply waited for her to lead them to the prize. Richard was far too paranoid to let Kai walk away with an unresolved mystery, especially one his father deemed most valuable. "I see the door. It's open." Another voice yelled a heavy, unfamiliar grunt that belonged to hired muscle. Kai's eyes darted around the bunker. She had seconds. She grabbed the leather ledger, shoving it into her waterproof backpack. She snatched the trust documents, folded them, and shoved them deep into her jacket pocket. She looked at the heavy vault door. She couldn't lock it from the inside without the key, and if they trapped her in here, she was dead. Behind the warm-up desk, Kai noticed a heavy iron grate set into the floor, an emergency drainage and ventilation shaft. She threw herself onto the floor, her fingers hooking into the rusted iron slats. With a scream of effort, she hauled the grate upward. It gave way, revealing a narrow, claustrophobic pipe that smelled heavily of river water and wet earth. Heavy boots hit the concrete floor just outside the vault. "Kai." Greg's voice boomed into the room, dripping with false sweetness. "Don't do anything stupid, honey. Richard just wants to have a look at whatever Granddad left you. We can make a deal." Kai didn't answer. She swung her legs into the dark pipe, sliding down into the freezing, muddy water, just as the beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight swept across the warm-up desk. "She's in the floor," a man shouted. Kai pushed herself forward, crawling on her hands and knees through the pitch-black, freezing water. The pipe was barely wide enough for her shoulders. Spiders and unseen debris brushed against her face, but adrenaline fueled her movements. She could hear Greg cursing loudly behind her, but the hired muscle was too broad to fit into the drainage shaft. She crawled for what felt like miles, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning in the stale air. Finally, the pipe angled upward, and she saw the faint, gray ambient light of the storm. She kicked against a heavy iron flap, bursting out into the torrential rain. She tumbled down a muddy embankment, landing hard in the reeds at the swollen Willow Creek. She scrambled to her feet, wiping freezing mud from her eyes. She was about half a mile from the train depot. She could see the beams of flashlights cutting through the trees near her parked Honda Civic. They were slashing her tires. Kai didn't hesitate. She turned her back on her car and ran into the dense, dark woods, clutching the strap of her backpack like a lifeline. She had the key. She had the ledger. Now she just had to survive the night. Morning light flooded the glass facade of Harrington Shipping and Logistics, illuminating a boardroom poised for triumph. Richard Harrington stood at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by elite attorneys. Beatrice lounged nearby, calm and indulgent, while Greg hovered by the window, tense but silent. "Everything is ready," the lead attorney said, sliding forward the final documents. "Once you sign, control is absolute," Richard smiled, lifting his gold pen. "A new era begins." But the doors burst open. Security stumbled as Kai walked in, mud-streaked, exhausted, but unshaken. Her presence cut through the room like a blade. Every eye turned. "Remove her," Richard snapped. "I'm not trespassing," Kai replied, her voice steady as she approached the table. Greg lunged forward. "Get her out!" Kai didn't move. Instead, she dropped a heavy iron key onto the polished surface, then slammed down a worn leather ledger. The impact echoed through the silence. "Touch me," she said coldly, "and you'll add assault to the charges already coming." The attorneys leaned back, wary now. "You've lost your mind," Beatrice scoffed. Kai didn't look at her. "Check the first page," she told the lead attorney. "Signed copies are already with the SEC, the FBI, and the press. Sent at 6 this morning. As the Richards confidence cracked." "What did you do?" "I didn't," Kay said quietly. "Granddad did." The attorney opened the ledger. As he read, his composure unraveled. Pages turned faster. His expression shifted from confusion to alarm. My God, he looked up, voice tight. "Do not sign those documents." Richard slammed his fist down. "It's my company." The assistant attorney shook his head. "Not anymore." "Because," the attorney said, his voice trembling slightly, "if you sign these documents, you are legally assuming personal liability for over $400 million in uncollateralized, fraudulent debt. This company is entirely insolvent. The profits are fabricated, the assets have been illegally leveraged. If you take ownership today, you will be arrested before the week is out." Beatrice dropped her mimosa glass. It shattered on the carpet, the orange liquid seeping into the fibers. "But my 15 million? She choked out. "There is no 15 million, Beatrice," Kai said, turning to her aunt. "The offshore accounts tied to the estate are empty. They have been empty for years. You inherited an estate that has 3 mortgages on it. You are bankrupt." Richard staggered backward, knocking his chair over. He clutched his chest, gasping for air as the reality of his utter ruin collapsed upon him. He had waited his entire life for the throne, only to find it was an electric chair. "Where is the money?" Richard whispered violently, his eyes wild, darting toward Kai. "The real profits. He made billions." "Where did he hide it?" Kai picked up the iron servant key, slipping it safely back into her pocket. "He left it to the only person who didn't view him as a paycheck," Kai said, her voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "He left it in the servant trust, and I am the sole beneficiary." "Not at all." She turned her back on her uncle, who was now weeping openly, and her aunt, who was screaming at her husband in a panic. The Cravath attorneys were already packing their briefcases, abandoning their disgraced clients with ruthless corporate efficiency. Kai walked out of the boardroom, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind her, cutting off the sounds of their destruction. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the numbers descend. She had walked into the building as a dismissed, overlooked schoolteacher. She was walking out as a billionaire. But as she touched the cold iron key in her pocket, she knew she wouldn't keep the money. She would pay off the stolen debts, dismantle the corrupt empire, and build something entirely new, something Rowan never could. The vultures had finally starved. What would you do if your family left you with nothing but a rusty key and a target on your back? Kai proved that the best revenge isn't just surviving, it's rewriting the rules of the game. If you loved this story of hidden betrayal, corporate takedowns, and poetic justice, hit that like button, share with your fellow mystery lovers, and subscribe for more thrilling real-life dramas.